The airplane wheels touched down in Florence with a gentle thud that seemed to echo through my chest. 5,000 miles. That's how far I'd traveled to see the man I still called Dad, even though it had been 5 years since we'd spoken face to face. My hands trembled as I gripped the armrest, watching the Italian countryside blur past the small window. The other passengers were already reaching for their overhead bags, chatting excitedly about their vacations or business trips, but I sat frozen in my seat. This wasn't a vacation for me. This was supposed to be a homecoming, a reunion with the only parent I had left after Mom passed away 3 years ago. I'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times during the long flight from San Francisco. What would I say when I saw him? Would he cry? Would he hug me so tight that all those years of silence would just melt away? Gerald had always been a man of few words, but his hugs spoke volumes. I remembered being 7 years old, running into his arms after a nightmare, and feeling like nothing in the world could hurt me as long as he was there. Now, at 28, I was that scared little girl again, desperately hoping that some part of that protective father still existed somewhere inside the stranger he'd become. The taxi ride through Florence's winding streets felt like a dream sequence. Ancient buildings lined the roads, their weathered stones telling stories of centuries past, but I barely noticed their beauty. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Sarah. "How are you feeling? Remember, you're brave for doing this." Brave. That's what everyone kept telling me. But sitting in the back of that taxi, clutching the piece of paper with Dad's address written in my shaky handwriting, I felt anything but brave. I felt like I was about to walk into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided against me. The driver, a kind elderly man with gentle eyes, kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Prima volta a Firenze?" he asked in broken English, sensing my nervousness. "First time in Florence." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. He smiled warmly and began pointing out landmarks, trying to distract me from whatever was clearly weighing on my mind. The Duomo's magnificent dome rose in the distance, and under different circumstances, I might have been breathless at its beauty. Instead, all I could think about was the last conversation I'd had with Dad, 5 years ago, when he'd told me he was moving to Italy to start fresh. I'd begged him not to go, but he'd already made up his mind. As we pulled up to a charming residential street lined with terracotta-roofed houses, my heart began pounding so hard I was sure the driver could hear it. The house was exactly as I'd imagined it from Dad's sparse descriptions in his emails. Cream-colored walls, green shutters, and a small garden bursting with colorful flowers. It looked like a postcard, like the kind of place where happy families gathered for Sunday dinners and children played in the yard. I paid the driver with trembling hands, thanking him in my broken Italian, and watched as he drove away, taking with him my last chance to change my mind and flee back to the airport. Standing on the sidewalk with my single suitcase, I took a deep breath and tried to summon the courage that had carried me across an ocean. The afternoon sun was warm on my face, and somewhere in the distance, church bells were ringing. It should have been peaceful, romantic even, but all I felt was a growing sense of dread. What if he didn't want to see me? What if showing up unannounced was a mistake? I'd tried calling, but his number had been disconnected. His emails had become shorter and less frequent over the years, until they'd stopped altogether 6 months ago. But he was my father. Surely that still meant something. I walked up the stone pathway, noting how well-maintained everything was. Dad had always been meticulous about his yard back home in Oregon, and it seemed that hadn't changed. There were children's toys scattered near the front steps, a small bicycle, some colorful balls, a forgotten doll with golden hair. My stomach lurched. Children's toys. Dad had never mentioned children in his emails. In fact, he'd barely mentioned anything about his new life at all. I'd assumed he was living alone, maybe dating someone casually, but the evidence before me suggested something much more permanent, much more complete. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I raised my hand and knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed through what I imagined was a warm, inviting home where my father had built a new life. I smoothed down my hair and adjusted my jacket, wanting to look presentable for our reunion. Footsteps approached from inside, and I held my breath, preparing to see the face that had been absent from my life for far too long. The door swung open, and instead of my father's familiar weathered features and kind blue eyes, I found myself staring at a woman I'd never seen before. Tall, elegant, with dark hair pulled back in a perfect bun, and cold, assessing eyes that looked me up and down like I was something unpleasant she'd found on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice crisp and unwelcoming. She was probably in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored blouse and tailored pants that screamed expensive taste. Everything about her seemed polished and perfect, from her manicured nails to her subtle but flawless makeup. I stood there for a moment, completely thrown off balance. This wasn't how I'd imagined this moment would go. Where was Dad? Why was this stranger answering his door? My mouth felt dry as I tried to find my voice, suddenly very aware of how rumpled I must look after the long flight and taxi ride. "I'm looking for Gerald Morrison," I managed to say, my voice coming out smaller than I'd intended. "I'm his daughter, Amanda." The words felt strange on my tongue. When was the last time I'd had to introduce myself as someone's daughter to a stranger? The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or perhaps annoyance. She didn't step aside to let me in, didn't smile, didn't show any of the warmth you'd expect when meeting your partner's child for the first time. Instead, she seemed to be studying me, taking inventory of my features, my clothes, my very presence on her doorstep. "Gerald isn't available right now," she said finally, her tone suggesting that this conversation was already over. But I could hear voices inside the house, children laughing, a television playing, the sounds of a family going about their evening routine. And underneath it all, I could swear I heard a familiar voice, deeper and more gravelly than I remembered, but unmistakably his. My father was in there, just beyond this woman who was acting like a gatekeeper to my own family. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He was home. He was right there, and this woman was deliberately keeping me from him. "I've come a very long way to see him," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and polite, despite the growing panic in my chest. "I flew in from San Francisco today. Could you please tell him that Amanda is here?" I emphasized my name, hoping it would trigger some recognition, some understanding of who I was and why I had every right to be standing on this doorstep. But the woman's expression remained unchanged, cold and unwelcoming. If anything, she seemed to grow more rigid, more determined to keep me exactly where I was, on the outside, looking in. "I'm sorry, but you weren't invited," she said, and the words hit me like a slap across the face. Weren't invited? I was his daughter. Since when did daughters need invitations to visit their fathers? The casual cruelty of her statement left me speechless for a moment. Behind her, I could hear footsteps approaching, and my heart leaped with hope. Maybe Dad had heard my voice. Maybe he was coming to see what was happening at the door. Maybe this whole misunderstanding would be cleared up in a matter of seconds, and we'd all laugh about it later over dinner. But when a man's voice called out from somewhere inside the house, asking, "Chi è alla porta?" "Who's at the door?" the woman turned her head slightly and responded in rapid Italian. I caught only fragments, but I heard my name, spoken with what sounded like disdain. There was a long pause, and then I heard my father's voice again, quieter this time, saying something I couldn't make out. The woman nodded and turned back to me, her expression even colder than before. Whatever conversation had just taken place behind that door, it hadn't gone in my favor. "As I said, you weren't invited," she repeated, and this time, there was a finality to her tone that made my blood run cold. "I think it would be best if you left." She began to close the door, but I stepped forward instinctively, my hand reaching out to stop her. The desperation in my own movement surprised me. I'd traveled 5,000 miles. I'd spent my savings on this trip. I'd worked up the courage to face the man who'd walked out of my life 5 years ago. I wasn't going to be turned away by a stranger without even seeing his face. "Wait, please," I said, my voice cracking with emotion I could no longer contain. "I just need 5 minutes. I just need to talk to him. I'm his daughter." The word came out like a plea, and I hated how small and desperate I sounded. But the woman's expression didn't soften. If anything, she looked annoyed by my persistence. She glanced back into the house as if checking to make sure no one was watching, then stepped closer to me, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me want to step backward. "You need to leave. Now, before you cause any more problems than you already have." Problems? What problems could I possibly be causing by wanting to see my own father? The woman's words echoed in my head as I stood there, feeling more confused and hurt with each passing second. I could hear children's voices getting louder inside the house, and suddenly a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, appeared beside the woman. She had Gerald's blue eyes and his stubborn chin, and the resemblance was so striking that it took my breath away. This child looked more like my father than I ever had. She peered up at me with curious innocence, completely unaware of the tension crackling between the adults above her. "Mama, chi è questa signora?" the little girl asked in perfect Italian, tugging on the woman's perfectly pressed pants. The woman, who was apparently this child's mother, quickly placed a protective hand on the girl's shoulder and guided her away from the door. But not before I caught the way the child's eyes lingered on me, as if she sensed something familiar, but couldn't quite place what it was. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as the reality of the situation began to crystallize. Dad had a new family, a wife, a daughter, a whole life that I wasn't part of, had never been part of, and apparently never would be. "Sophia, go back inside and finish your homework," the woman said firmly, her voice switching to accented English for my benefit. Sophia. Even her name was beautiful, musical in a way that my plain American name had never been. I watched as this little girl, my half-sister, I realized with a jolt, obediently disappeared back into the house, her footsteps echoing down what sounded like a long hallway. The woman turned back to me, and now I could see something else in her expression: fear. She was afraid of me, or rather, afraid of what my presence might do to the carefully constructed life she'd built with my father. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been married?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted asking. Did I really want to know? Did I want to hear that while I'd been grieving my mother's death alone, sending unanswered emails to my father, he'd been building a new family with someone else? The woman hesitated, clearly debating whether to answer me at all. When she finally spoke, her words confirmed my worst fears. 7 years, she said quietly, and the number hit me like a physical blow. 7 years. That meant he'd been with her before he'd even left Oregon, before he'd told me he needed to start fresh, before he'd made me believe that his departure was about finding himself, not about replacing me. I felt dizzy, like the ground beneath my feet was shifting. All those years I'd spent wondering what I'd done wrong, why he'd grown so distant, why he'd stopped calling as often. It hadn't been about me at all. It had been about her, about them, about the family he'd wanted more than the one he already had. "And Sophia?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The woman's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't respond. But then, perhaps realizing that I wasn't going to simply disappear, she sighed heavily. "She's 6, she said, and I did the math quickly in my head. 6 years old. That meant she'd been born just a year before Dad left Oregon. A year before he'd sat me down and told me he needed space, needed to figure out who he was without my mother's memory haunting every corner of our house. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place now, creating a picture I didn't want to see. While I'd been helping him sort through Mom's belongings, while I'd been trying to be strong for both of us in our grief, he'd already been planning his escape. He'd already had another woman, another child, another life waiting for him across the ocean. I'd been so naive, thinking that his distance was about processing his loss. Instead, it had been about processing his guilt, the guilt of having a secret family while his wife was dying, the guilt of wanting to be with them instead of with me. "Does she know about me?" I asked, gesturing toward the house where I could still hear Sophia's voice, mixing with what sounded like a boy's laughter. Another child. How many children did he have now? How many replacements for the daughter he'd left behind? The woman's silence was answer enough, but she confirmed it anyway. "No," she said simply. "Gerald thought it would be complicated. Better to let the past stay in the past." The past? That's what I was to him now. Not his daughter, not his family, not someone worth fighting for or staying in touch with. Just the past. Something to be left behind like an old photograph in a drawer. "The past," I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Is that what he calls me?" The woman shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting having said so much. But now that the floodgates were open, I couldn't stop myself from asking the questions that had been burning inside me for years. Did he ever mention me? When your children asked about his life before Italy, did he tell them they had a sister in America? Or did he just pretend I never existed? My voice was rising, despite my efforts to stay calm, and I could see neighbors starting to peer out their windows, drawn by the commotion. The woman glanced nervously at the street, clearly worried about making a scene. "Please lower your voice," she hissed, stepping closer to me. "The children don't need to hear this." The children. Always the children. Her children. His new children. The ones who mattered enough to protect. Unlike the daughter he'd abandoned without a second thought. I wanted to scream, to demand that she let me see him, to force my way past her and confront the man who'd given me life and then acted like I'd never been born. But something in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was pity. "He never told them," she admitted quietly, and the confirmation of what I'd already suspected felt like a knife twisting in my chest. When we moved here, he said he wanted a fresh start. No complications from his old life. Complications. That's what 23 years of being his daughter had been reduced to, a complication. I thought about all the Father's Day cards I'd sent that had gone unanswered, all the emails updating him on my life that had received increasingly brief responses before stopping altogether. I'd thought he was just bad at staying in touch. I'd never imagined he was actively trying to erase me. From inside the house, I could hear my father's voice getting closer, speaking in rapid Italian to someone, probably asking what was taking so long at the door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized this might be my only chance to see him, to look him in the eye and ask him why he'd chosen them over me, why he'd let me believe that his leaving was about grief when it was really about guilt, why he'd made me feel like I wasn't worth staying for, wasn't worth fighting for, wasn't worth even a phone call on my birthday. "I need to see him," I said, my voice breaking. "I need to hear him say it himself. I need to hear him tell me that I don't matter anymore." The woman's expression softened slightly, and for a moment I thought she might actually let me in. But then footsteps approached the door, and she quickly stepped back, positioning herself firmly in the doorway, like a human barrier between me and the man I'd once called Daddy. "Lucia, tutto ben?" My father's voice was right there, just beyond the doorframe, so close I could almost reach out and touch him. Lucia. So that was her name. The woman who'd taken my place, who'd given him the family he'd apparently always wanted. She turned slightly, speaking to him in Italian, her voice urgent and low. I caught fragments. Americana, problema, andare via. American, problem, go away. She was telling him to make me leave, to send me away like I was some unwanted solicitor rather than his flesh and blood. There was a long pause, and then I heard him sigh heavily. It was a sound I remembered from my childhood, the same sigh he'd made when I'd disappointed him, when I'd brought home a bad grade or broken something valuable. But this time, I wasn't the one who'd done something wrong. This time, he was the one who should be ashamed. "Dile che non posso vederla," he said finally. And even though my Italian was limited, I understood enough. Tell her I can't see her. Not won't. Can't. As if seeing his own daughter was somehow impossible, somehow beyond his capabilities. Lucia turned back to me, and I could see the relief in her eyes that she wouldn't have to be the villain anymore. She had his permission now, his blessing to turn me away. "I'm sorry," she said, though she didn't sound sorry at all. "Gerald says he can't see you right now. Perhaps you could try calling first next time." Next time. As if there would be a next time. As if I would ever put myself through this humiliation again. As if I would ever again travel 5,000 miles to be rejected by the one person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. The door began to close, and with it, any hope I'd harbored of reconciling with my father, of understanding why he'd left, of finding some way to be part of his life again. I stood there on the doorstep for what felt like an eternity after the door closed, staring at the cream-colored wood that had just shut me out of my father's life forever. The finality of it was crushing, like a weight pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Around me, Florence continued its evening routine. Children playing in nearby yards, the distant sound of scooters on cobblestone streets, the warm golden light of the setting sun painting everything in shades of amber and rose. But I felt completely disconnected from it all, like I was watching life happen through a thick pane of glass. My legs felt weak, and I had to grip my suitcase handle to keep from collapsing right there on his perfectly manicured pathway. The little girl's face kept flashing in my mind, Those blue eyes that looked so much like his, so much like mine, belonging to a child who would grow up never knowing she had a sister who'd once loved the same man with all her heart. The walk back to the main street felt like moving through quicksand, each step requiring enormous effort as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd been naive to think that showing up unannounced would somehow fix 5 years of silence, that my presence alone would be enough to remind him of the bond we'd once shared. But the man behind that door wasn't the father who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd stayed up all night when I had pneumonia, who'd walked me to school on my first day because I was too scared to go alone. That man had died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who could look his own daughter in the eye, or rather, refuse to look her in the eye, and pretend she didn't exist. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and called a taxi, my voice barely steady enough to give the address of a hotel I'd Googled during the flight. The driver who picked me up was different from the kind man who'd brought me here, and I was grateful for his silence as tears finally began to fall. The hotel room was small and sterile, nothing like the warm family home I'd imagined staying in when I'd booked this trip. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, still in my travel clothes, and tried to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with messages from Sarah, asking how the reunion had gone, if I was happy, if Dad had cried when he saw me. I couldn't bring myself to respond. How do you tell someone that your father has erased you so completely from his life that his new family doesn't even know you exist? How do you explain that the man who once promised to always be there for you has chosen to pretend you were never born? I stared at the messages until the words blurred together, then turned the phone face down on the nightstand. I wasn't ready to make this real by putting it into words. Wasn't ready to admit to anyone, including myself, that I'd been so thoroughly rejected by the one person whose love I'd thought was guaranteed. As the hours passed and Florence settled into night outside my window, I found myself replaying every interaction I'd had with my father over the past 5 years, looking for signs I'd missed, the emails that had grown shorter and less personal, the phone calls that had become less frequent before stopping altogether, the way he'd deflected my questions about his new life in Italy, always changing the subject when I asked if he was dating anyone or if he'd made friends. I'd attributed it all to grief, to his struggle with starting over after Mom's death. But now I understood that it hadn't been about grief at all. It had been about guilt. Guilt over the secret family he'd been building while his wife was dying. Guilt over the daughter he was planning to abandon. Guilt over the lies he'd been telling for years. And instead of facing that guilt, instead of finding a way to include both families in his life, he'd chosen the easier path. He'd chosen to simply erase the inconvenient parts of his past. The next morning brought no clarity, only a hollow ache that seemed to have settled permanently in my chest. I ordered room service coffee and sat by the window, watching the city wake up below me. Somewhere out there, in a house with green shutters and children's toys in the yard, my father was probably having breakfast with his real family. Maybe he was helping Sophia with her homework or listening to his son, I still didn't know his name, talk about his plans for the day. Maybe Lucia was packing their lunches, and they were all laughing about something silly one of the children had said. It was the kind of morning routine I'd once shared with him, back when I was the child who mattered, back when I was part of his daily life, instead of a complication to be hidden away. The thought of him living that same domestic happiness with another family, while I sat alone in a hotel room, grieving the relationship we'd lost, was almost unbearable. But what hurt even more was the realization that he wasn't grieving it at all. For him, I was already gone. I spent the day walking through Florence's ancient streets, trying to lose myself in the beauty of a city I'd dreamed of visiting under such different circumstances. The Duomo's magnificent facade, the bustling energy of the Ponte Vecchio, the quiet courtyards hidden behind unassuming doorways. It should have been magical. Instead, everything felt muted, like I was seeing it all through a fog of heartbreak. I found myself wondering if Dad had walked these same streets with his new family, if he'd pointed out architectural details to Sophia the way he'd once done with me during our trips to museums and historic sites. Had he taken her to gelato shops and let her order whatever flavor she wanted? Had he carried her on his shoulders when her little legs got tired? Had he given her all the love and attention he'd once given me, but with the added joy of knowing this time he wouldn't have to leave her behind? By evening, I'd made my decision. I couldn't stay in Florence, Couldn't spend another day in the same city where my father was living his happy life without me. But I also couldn't leave without trying one more time. I wrote a letter, a real, handwritten letter on hotel stationery, pouring out everything I'd wanted to say to him. I told him about Mom's final days, how she'd asked about him constantly, how she'd died believing he still loved us both. I told him about my job, my apartment, the life I'd built while waiting for him to come back or invite me to visit. I told him how proud I'd been when he'd finally started dating again, how I'd encouraged him to find happiness, even though it meant sharing him with someone else. And I told him how much it hurt to discover that his happiness had required my complete erasure, that loving his new family had somehow made it impossible for him to love me too. I sealed the letter in a hotel envelope and walked back to his house one last time, slipping it under his door in the darkness before returning to pack my bags. The flight home felt endless. 13 hours of sitting with my thoughts and trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been shattered by the truth. I'd spent 5 years believing that my father's distance was temporary, that eventually we'd find our way back to each other. Now I knew that the father I'd been missing, the man I'd traveled 5,000 miles to see, no longer existed. He'd been replaced by someone who could look at his own daughter as a threat to his happiness, someone who could choose silence over honesty, abandonment over the messy work of loving two families at once. As the plane descended into San Francisco, I realized that I wasn't just grieving the relationship we'd lost. I was grieving the man I'd thought he was, the father who'd existed only in my memories and my desperate hope for reconciliation. The hardest part wasn't accepting that he didn't want me in his life anymore. The hardest part was accepting that maybe he never really had.